Hello and welcome to the last module in Aperture Week 2. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of Aperture Priority Mode. We've talked about what aperture is. I've shown you lots and lots of examples of how your picture changes when you change the aperture. So I want to talk really quickly about Aperture Priority Mode. So Aperture Priority Mode is, if you recall, when we looked at the 4 quadrants of the camera, you've got the upper left quadrant, which is where the camera controls everything. Think of this as essentially your iPhone. This is auto. And then if you go over to the right, this is the semi-automatic. So it's not all, the camera is doing everything. It is choosing all the settings. You can't change anything. However, you can give the camera a hint as to what you want it to do. Are you taking a portrait? Are you taking landscape? Is it nighttime? So it helps the camera understand what you're trying to do, but you're still not making any decisions. So that's why I really like to stay in the lower quadrant, or the lower half of this quadrant. And on the left-hand side is what I like to call the semi-manual modes. And that's aperture priority and shutter priority. So right now, let's talk about aperture priority. So aperture priority, if you look over here on the dial, on Canon, it's AV, which stands for aperture value. And on Nikon, it's an A for aperture. And on Sony, it's an A for aperture. I think most cameras, it's an A for aperture. Canon is the anomaly. And so what that means is when you turn your dial to AV, you then turn the dial over here and you set your aperture. So the number that's moving, it'll go, depending on what your lens is. Let's say you have an 18 to 55, 3.5 to 5.6. It's going to start at 3.5, and as you roll it, it's going to go 4, 5.6, 6.3, 7.1. That's the aperture is changing. So as you change the aperture, the camera automatically changes the shutter for you. So it's doing kind of the heavy lifting. And then you can adjust the ISO based on some of the factors that we're going to talk about. So let's go ahead and talk about aperture priority a little bit. So first of all, I want to tell you that I shoot in aperture priority a lot. Not all the time. I know how to shoot in manual. I shoot in manual under certain situations exclusively. So it's really important to eventually understand manual. But while you're learning, there's a lot of great benefits to aperture priority. I mean, we pay a lot of money for these cameras. Why don't we let them do some of the work they were meant to do? So one of the great things about aperture priority mode is the entry-level lenses, likely the lenses that came with your camera. So the 18 to 55, 3.5 to 5.6. We talked a little bit about those in the lens module. The 70 to 300, where it goes from 5.6 to 6.3 or 4 to 6.3. What happens when you turn when you zoom in and out, so at the wide end, let's go back and use the 18 to 55 because that's the lens that most entry-level cameras come with. At 18, which is the widest, you're going to have a 3.5 aperture. So remember what that means. The hole is going to be, let's just say it's this big, okay? When you zoom in to 55, the aperture suddenly becomes, the widest it will get is 5.6. So it goes from here to here. It gets a little smaller. What does that mean? It means it lets in less light. What does that mean? Your exposure changes. What does that mean? Your shutter has to change. So when you have a variable lens where it's changing, every time you move this, it's changing the exposure, aperture value will automatically adjust your shutter for you. You don't have to think about it. In manual, every time you zoom, and the exposure changes, you have to change the shutter speed as well. So aperture priority is a great mode to shoot in when you're learning and you don't have a fixed aperture lens. So if that doesn't make sense, rewind this and just rewatch it because it took me a while to get that. But that's one of the benefits while you're learning to use aperture value, or aperture priority, I'm sorry. Another good reason is in lighting conditions that are changing. So I want you to envision with me a soccer game. It's a cloudy afternoon and the sun is coming in and out of the clouds, in and out of the clouds, all right? So every time the sun comes in and out of the clouds, your exposure's changing. So you're gonna need more light, less light, more light, less light, depending on whether the sun is out of the clouds or behind the clouds. Makes perfect sense, right? So in aperture value, or I keep saying that, aperture priority mode, again, the camera is going to do the heavy lifting for you. It's going to change the shutter as those clouds move over and away from the sun. Aperture value can be a little tricky with backlight. So with backlight, where you have the back coming in from behind and you have that really pretty halo of light, I like to shoot that way a lot, but I really like to shoot that in manual because all that light coming from behind and into your camera can really mess up the sensor. It gets confused. It thinks there's a lot of light. It thinks there's more light than there is. So you end up getting dark pictures, similar to if you've taken a picture with your iPhone into backlight and you get a dark subject. That can also happen as well with your big girl camera. Maybe not as bad, maybe sometimes it is as bad. But when you put it in manual, you can control that more. But just know that if it's a sunny day, you're rarely gonna have a problem with aperture priority mode. Where it can come and it can bite you in the butt, and I'm gonna show you specifics next week, is when, let's go back to that soccer game that we've been talking about. It's 4 or 5 o'clock, it's the fall, the sun is setting, you're not paying attention, you're in aperture priority mode. So it's getting darker and darker. So what's gonna happen is the camera's gonna adjust and it's gonna keep slowing the shutter down to let more light in because the sun is going away, it's setting. So if you're not paying attention, you're gonna start getting really, really blurry pictures. And trust me, this has happened to me more than once. And I'm going to show you some specific examples of this next week. So what you have to do to combat that is once it starts going dusk and your shutter speed is starting to slow down quite a bit, you need to raise your ISO. So I like to think of this, you know how they say a rising tide raises all boats? Well, a rising ISO takes the shutter speed with it, okay? Because it's letting more light in, so you need a faster shutter speed to keep it from being overexposed. So this will keep your shutter speed high enough to freeze the action of the soccer game or whatever you're shooting. So as long as you're keeping an eye on that, aperture priority will continue to work great for you even as the sun sets. But again, we're gonna talk more. If this isn't making sense, that's okay. We're gonna talk about this in week 3, and then you can come back and watch this and it'll all come together very easily. So that's really the end of this video. Let me know if you have any questions on aperture priority mode or any of the aperture lessons that we've had. And I will see you next week, and we will talk about the third piece of the exposure triangle, and that is shutter speed. And I think you're really going to like it. Thanks.